My name is Caroline, and I am 24 years old. I recently moved back home with my dad after graduating college. Things had been strained between us since my mom died when I was 13. But nothing prepared me for what happened last month when he looked me straight in the eyes during dinner and said those unbelievable words, "I can't afford to feed you anymore." The shock of hearing that from my only living parent broke something inside me. Let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of emotional neglect. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota with what I thought was a happy family. My early childhood memories are filled with weekend trips to the lake holiday celebrations with extended family, and my mom's famous Sunday morning pancakes shaped like animals. My dad worked as an accountant at a local firm, while my mom taught second grade at the elementary school. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. Everything changed when I was 13. Mom started feeling tired all the time, and then came the diagnosis, no family wants to hear, stage 4, ovarian cancer. The next 8 months were a blur of hospital visits, treatment schedules, and watching my vibrant mother fade away. My dad seemed to withdraw more with each passing week. By the time Mom passed away, he had already become a shell of his former self. After the funeral, it was like Dad forgot how to connect emotionally. He provided the basics: food, shelter, school supplies. But the animated conversations and family game nights disappeared. I would try to talk about my day or ask about his, but his responses became increasingly brief and disinterested. "Fine" and "okay" became his favorite words. As I navigated my teenage years without maternal guidance, I threw myself into academics. Getting straight A's became my coping mechanism. Maybe if I was successful enough, Dad would notice me again. Maybe he would be proud. But even when I was named valedictorian of my high school, his only response was a quick, "good job," before returning to watching television. I earned a full academic scholarship to State University, studying business with a minor in finance. During college, I worked part-time at the campus bookstore and as a research assistant to help cover living expenses and minimize student loans. Dad rarely visited campus. Our phone calls were infrequent and awkward, usually lasting less than 5 minutes. When graduation came around last spring, the job market was tighter than expected. My student loans were about to enter repayment, and I needed time to find a job that would utilize my degree. Moving back home temporarily seemed like the most practical solution, even though the thought of returning to that emotionally barren house filled me with dread. The reunion with Dad was as awkward as I expected. He gave me a stiff half hug and showed me to my old bedroom, which had remained virtually untouched since I left for college. "Stay as long as you need," he said, though his tone suggested he hoped it wouldn't be long. The first few weeks at home, I noticed strange behaviors I hadn't picked up on during my brief holiday visits over the years. Dad would quickly hide mail when I entered the room. He took phone calls in hushed tones behind closed doors. And despite claiming money was tight, I noticed shopping bags from expensive stores appearing regularly. I was determined to contribute to household expenses even while job hunting. I used my small savings to buy groceries and offered to pay a portion of utilities. Dad accepted my money, but continued making occasional comments about another mouth to feed and doubled electricity costs that stung deeply. One evening, I discovered a receipt for a rare coin purchase totaling over $2,000. This was the same week Dad had told me he couldn't afford to fix the broken water heater, forcing us to take cold showers. When I gently asked about this discrepancy, he became defensive and accused me of snooping through his things. "What I spend my money on is none of your business," he snapped. "This is still my house." I backed down, not wanting to create more tension when I was financially dependent on his roof. But the incident planted the first seed of suspicion that something wasn't right with Dad's financial situation, or his claims about it. After 2 months of intensive searching, I finally landed an entry-level position at a marketing firm. The salary was lower than I had hoped for, but it was a foot in the door in my field. I was genuinely excited to tell Dad the news and to start contributing more substantially to household expenses. "That's great," he said without looking up from his tablet. "When will your first paycheck come in?" There was no congratulations, no pride, just immediate focus on when I could pay more. Still, I tried to stay positive. I calculated a fair amount to contribute based on my salary and presented Dad with a budget plan for household expenses. "This isn't nearly enough," he said, pushing the paper back toward me. "Do you have any idea how much food prices have gone up? Or what the heating bill is going to be this winter, with you taking those long showers?" I was taking 5-minute showers with lukewarm water at best, but I didn't argue. Instead, I increased my proposed contribution, cutting into what I had planned to put toward my student loans. Dad seemed satisfied, at least temporarily. As weeks passed, the passive-aggressive comments continued. "If I ate dinner at home, food doesn't grow on trees, you know. If I stayed home on weekends to save money, the electricity bill is going to be through the roof with you always here." One Saturday morning, I went into the garage looking for a screwdriver to fix a loose doorknob. In the back of Dad's workbench drawer, I found a collection catalog with dozens of rare coins circled. Next to it was a receipt for a coin auction website showing thousands of dollars in purchases over the past month. That same week, Dad had claimed he couldn't afford to continue our family health insurance policy and suggested I find my own coverage through work, which wouldn't kick in for another 3 months. The disparity between his claimed financial hardship and his expensive hobby was becoming impossible to ignore. Later that month, while Dad was at work, I noticed an overdue notice for the electric bill sticking out from under a pile of magazines. Curious and increasingly concerned, I looked further and found more unopened bills and late notices. Some were months old. This wasn't just about prioritizing coins over home repairs. It seemed Dad was neglecting essential payments altogether. That evening, I tried to broach the subject carefully. "Dad, I found some overdue notices today. Is everything okay with the bills?" His face immediately flushed with anger. "You were going through my mail. How dare you invade my privacy?" "I wasn't snooping," I explained calmly. "The electric notice was visible, and I'm concerned. If you're having financial difficulties, maybe we can work out a better system for the household expenses." "There's nothing wrong with my system," he snapped. "I've managed just fine all these years without your financial advice." "But these bills are months overdue. I'm worried about—" "Enough!" he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is my house and my business. Your contribution barely covers the extra expenses you create. If you don't like how I handle things, you can find your own place." I retreated to my room, shaken by his outburst. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something wasn't adding up. Dad had a stable accounting job with a decent salary. Our house wasn't extravagant, and the mortgage had to be mostly paid off by now. Even with his coin-collecting habit, how could basic bills be going unpaid? The next day, while using Dad's computer to print job documents with permission, a notification popped up from an online gambling site. "Your daily bonus is waiting." I hadn't meant to pry, but the open tab showed recent transactions, hundreds of dollars wagered just the previous night. The discovery hit me like a truck. Dad wasn't just collecting coins, he was gambling online, possibly significantly. It would explain the secrecy, the defensive behavior, and the financial strain despite his solid income. I spent the next week observing more carefully and found more evidence: credit card statements showing cash advances, receipts from payday loan services, and multiple gambling apps on his phone. Dad wasn't struggling to feed an additional person in the house. He was feeding a growing addiction while maintaining an expensive collecting hobby. When I tried to discuss creating a household budget again, suggesting we both track expenses transparently, Dad became immediately hostile. "You think you can come back home after being gone for years and tell me how to run my finances? I'm an accountant, for God's sake. I don't need budgeting advice from someone who couldn't even find a decent job after college." His words stung, but I persisted. "I'm just trying to help. If we're both going to live here, shouldn't we both understand the household finances? I understand them just fine, he retorted. What you need to understand is that supporting an adult child wasn't in my retirement plan. Every day you're here sets me back. I stopped pushing that day, but the tension in the house became unbearable. Dad's mood swings grew more pronounced. He'd be pleasant when winning at gambling based on the notifications I occasionally glimpsed, and irritable or downright mean after losses. Meanwhile, more bills went unpaid, and I started noticing collection agency letters arriving. The emotional strain took its toll. I developed insomnia and anxiety jumping whenever Dad came home, never knowing which version of him I'd encounter. I started working longer hours at my new job, volunteering for overtime, just to avoid being home. My boss noticed my dedication and complimented my work ethic, unaware I was hiding from my increasingly volatile home situation. One evening, I discovered that Dad had taken the money I had given him for the water bill and spent it elsewhere. The proof was irrefutable. I had given him a check specifically marked water bill in the memo line, but the most recent shutoff notice showed no payment had been made in 2 months. When confronted, he claimed he had temporarily reallocated the funds for an investment opportunity that would benefit us both. The gaslighting and financial mismanagement were becoming too much to bear. But I had no idea how much worse things would get until that fateful dinner when everything finally came to a head. It was a Tuesday evening when my world turned upside down. I came home from work to discover the electricity had been shut off. No warning, no explanation, just a dark house and a notice taped to the door threatening legal action for non-payment of over 3 months of utility bills. I called Dad immediately, and he arrived home 30 minutes later, oddly calm about the situation. "It's just a misunderstanding," he said, barely glancing at the notice. "I'll sort it out tomorrow." "This isn't a misunderstanding," I insisted, pointing to the detailed account history showing no payments since I had moved back home. "They say we owe over $1,000. What happened to the money I gave you for utilities every month?" Dad's expression hardened. "Do you have any idea how expensive it is to keep this house running with you back? Your little contribution barely makes a dent." "But I gave you $300 just last month specifically for utilities," I said, confusion and anger rising within me. "What happened to that money?" "I had other pressing financial obligations," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "More pressing than electricity than having hot water." My voice was rising now. What could possibly be more important? We ended up ordering takeout since we couldn't cook without electricity. As we sat at the dining table with our Chinese food containers illuminated by battery-powered lanterns, I tried one more time to have a rational conversation about the household finances. "Dad, I think we need to be transparent with each other about the money situation. I'm contributing what I can from my entry-level salary, but I need to know that money is going toward what it's intended for." He stabbed at his food, not looking at me. "You have no idea what kind of financial pressure I'm under." "Then help me understand," I pleaded. "We're family. We should be able to talk about these things." That's when he put down his fork and looked at me with cold eyes I barely recognized. "You want to understand, fine. I can't afford to feed you anymore." "There. Is that transparent enough for you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat in stunned silence as he continued. "I was doing fine before you moved back in. I had my systems in place, my budget worked for one person. Then you show up with your expectations and your judgments, eating food using water and electricity taking up space. Your mother would have known how to handle this better. She always managed the household budget. Since she's been gone, it's been one financial disaster after another." Tears welled in my eyes. "Are you seriously blaming me for financial problems that clearly started long before I moved back? And bringing Mom into this? If you want to stay in this house," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "you need to double what you're contributing. Otherwise, you need to find somewhere else to live. I'm not running a charity here. Double, I gasped. That would be nearly 70% of my take-home pay. How am I supposed to save for my own place or pay my student loans? Not my problem, he said coldly. Adults pay their way in this world. Your mother and I worked hard for everything we had. We didn't move back in with our parents and become financial burdens. Something snapped inside me. After years of emotional neglect followed by months of gaslighting and financial manipulation, I couldn't take it anymore. My problem? You've been spending hundreds, maybe thousands on online gambling and coin collecting while neglecting basic bills, and I'm the financial burden I've been contributing consistently while you've been lying about where that money goes. Dad's face turned purple with rage. How dare you accuse me? You know nothing about adult responsibilities or what it takes to maintain a household. I know enough to pay bills on time and not gamble away money meant for utilities. I shot back. I've seen the gambling sites, Dad. I've seen the coin purchase receipts while we take cold showers because you won't fix the water heater. You're not struggling because of me. You're struggling because you have a gambling problem you won't acknowledge. The argument escalated from there with Dad throwing increasingly hurtful accusations. I was ungrateful. I was just like my mother, always nagging about money. I was a disappointment who couldn't even find a real job after college. Each barb cut deeper than the last. What hurt most was the revelation that came next. Aunt Susan called last week asking when I was going to repay the money she loaned me, he said with a sneer. You know what she loaned it for, to help support you. That's right. I've had to borrow money from family because of the financial strain you've put on this household. I was speechless. Aunt Susan was my mother's sister, who I'd always been close with. The idea that Dad had been borrowing money from her under false pretenses, using me as the excuse, was devastating. You told her you needed money because of me, I finally managed to ask. What was I supposed to say? That I can barely keep my head above water, that ever since your mother died, I've been drowning financially. At least this way people understand. Everyone sympathizes with a father trying to support his adult daughter who can't support herself. The manipulation and lies were too much. I got up from the table, my food barely touched. Where do you think you're going? Dad demanded. To call Aunt Susan, I replied, my voice shaking but determined. I want to hear exactly what you told her. Don't you dare, he shouted, rising from his chair. My conversations with family are private. Not when you're using me as your excuse to scam money from Mom's sister, I said, grabbing my phone. What I learned from that call changed everything. Not only had Dad borrowed thousands from Aunt Susan, claiming it was to help with my expensive medical treatments that didn't exist, but he'd done the same with other family members. For years, he'd been using me as his sympathy card to extract loans he never intended to repay, all while I was working my way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. After ending the call with a shocked and apologetic Aunt Susan, I confronted Dad with this new information. Instead of shame or remorse, he doubled down. So what family helps family? Your mother would have understood. No, I said, a newfound clarity washing over me. Mom would be ashamed of how you've exploited her memory and her family, and I'm done enabling this. In that moment, standing in our dark house with the unpaid utility notice in hand and the weight of years of emotional manipulation pressing down on me, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I'm not leaving this house, I said firmly. And I'm not giving you another cent until we get to the bottom of what's really going on with the family finances. Little did I know that my search for answers would reveal even more shocking truths and ultimately force me to make the hardest decision of my life, asking my own father to leave the home we had once shared as a happy family. The morning after our explosive argument, I took a personal day from work and began a methodical investigation into our household's financial situation. If Dad was going to accuse me of being a financial burden and threaten to kick me out, I needed to arm myself with facts. First, I gathered all my bank statements showing every payment I'd made to Dad since moving back home. I created a spreadsheet documenting dates, amounts, and what each payment was designated for utilities, groceries, or general household expenses. The total was substantial for someone on an entry-level salary and would have more than covered my share of household costs. Next, I photographed all the late notices and shut-off warnings I could find hidden around the house. The electricity wasn't the only utility in arrears. Water, gas, internet, and even the mortgage had late or missing payments. Some dated back to before I had even moved home, contradicting Dad's claim that I was the cause of his financial distress. While searching for more financial documents, I made a startling discovery in the back of Dad's home office closet, a dusty box labeled legal papers that I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. Inside were their marriage certificate, old tax returns, and Mom's will, which I realized I had never actually seen. With shaking hands, I unfolded the document and began to read. What I found changed everything. Mom had left her half of the house to me, not Dad. According to the will upon her death, ownership of the house was to be split 50-50 between Dad and me, with the provision that I would gain full access to my portion upon turning 21 or graduating college, whichever came later. I had graduated over a year ago. This house was half mine legally and rightfully. The will also mentioned a life insurance policy and investments that were to be placed in trust for my education and future security. I had never seen a penny of these funds, nor had Dad ever mentioned their existence. Had he somehow accessed them himself? Had he spent my inheritance while I worked multiple jobs to get through college? I needed professional guidance. Using some of my carefully saved emergency fund, I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney the following day. The meeting confirmed my suspicions and rights. Not only was I a legal co-owner of the house, but Dad had likely misappropriated funds that were designated for me in Mom's will. You have several options, the attorney explained. We can file for an accounting of the estate, potentially recover misappropriated funds, and establish your clear ownership rights to the property. Given the circumstances, you would be within your rights to request exclusive occupancy of the home pending resolution. Armed with legal advice and documentation, I prepared for the confrontation I knew would be difficult but necessary. I made copies of all important documents, stored digital versions in secure cloud storage, and even recorded a detailed account of recent events on my phone, just in case. When Dad returned from work that evening, I had restored the electricity by paying the outstanding balance myself and had prepared a simple dinner. I wanted this conversation to start calmly, though I doubted it would end that way. We need to talk about Mom's will, I said after he had taken a few bites. Dad's fork froze halfway to his mouth. What are you talking about? I found Mom's will today, I explained, keeping my voice steady. Along with some other interesting documents. Did you know that I legally own half of this house? The color drained from his face. You've been going through private papers. Those things are complicated, not something you would understand. Actually, I understand perfectly, I replied, sliding a copy of the will across the table. Mom left her half of the house to me, not you. I've had legal ownership since graduation. The attorney I spoke with today confirmed it. You went to an attorney, he sputtered, anger replacing his initial shock. Behind my back. Yes, just like you hid Mom's will and my inheritance behind my back for years, I countered. Where is the life insurance money, Dad? Where are the investment accounts Mom set up for my education? The ones that were supposed to be in trust for me? His face contorted between rage and panic. Your mother had no idea about finances. Those policies barely covered the funeral expenses. And maintaining this house costs money you can't imagine. That's not what the documents show, I said, presenting copies of the insurance policy and trust documents. These show substantial amounts that should have been preserved for my benefit. Instead, I worked through college and took on student debt while you apparently spent my inheritance. Dad's strategy shifted to one I knew well: emotional manipulation. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me, by attacking me with legal technicalities. What would your mother think of you turning on your father this way? Mom would be devastated to know you've squandered the financial security she tried to provide for me," I replied, refusing to be manipulated again. "She'd be heartbroken to know you've been lying to her family to borrow money under false pretenses." "You ungrateful little—" he began, rising from his chair. "Sit down," I commanded with an authority that surprised us both. He sat. "I'm not finished. Yesterday you told me you couldn't afford to feed me anymore. You threatened to kick me out of what I now know is partially my house. You've lied about finances, hidden legal documents from me, and possibly misappropriated my inheritance." I slid another document across the table, a formal notice I had drafted with the attorney's guidance. "I'm not leaving this house, Dad. You are. You have 30 days to find other accommodations." His face turned an alarming shade of red. "You can't kick me out of my own house. It's not just your house, it's also mine, and given your financial mismanagement and the evidence I've gathered of potential fraud regarding my inheritance, I have legal grounds to request exclusive occupancy." The attorney assured me that with the documentation I've found, a judge would likely rule in my favor. Dad's anger shifted to desperate negotiation. "You can't do this to me. Where am I supposed to go? What will people think? You should have considered that before gambling away bill money and lying to family about needing loans to support me," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I suggest you call Uncle Robert. I hear he has a spare room since Aunt Linda passed." "This isn't over," he threatened, standing again. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually, for the first time, I think I do," I answered. "I'm dealing with someone who has manipulated and gaslighted me for years, who has possibly stolen my inheritance, and who tried to make me believe I was a burden when he was the one mismanaging everything. The difference now is that I'm not going to allow it anymore." Dad stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard, a picture fell from the wall. The frame shattered on impact. Ironically, it was a family photo from before Mom got sick, the three of us smiling on a summer vacation. As I swept up the broken glass, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at finally standing up for myself, grief for the father I had once adored, fear about the conflict ahead, and beneath it all, a surprising sense of calm resolution. For the first time since Mom died, I had taken control of my own story, instead of allowing Dad to dictate the narrative. I knew he wouldn't give up easily. There would be attempts to regain control, to punish me for my defiance, to turn family against me. But as I placed the unharmed photo on the mantel, freed from its broken frame, I made a promise to myself and to Mom's memory. I would no longer be manipulated or made to feel guilty for claiming what was rightfully mine. Not just the physical property, but my dignity, my future, and my truth. True to my prediction, Dad didn't leave quietly. The first week after our confrontation was a storm of angry texts, voicemails, alternating between threats and guilt trips and flying monkeys, relatives and family friends calling to tell me how heartless I was being to throw my poor father out on the street. Most of these people had only heard Dad's version of events, that his ungrateful daughter had discovered a legal loophole and was vindictively evicting him from his home after he had sacrificed everything to support her. I refused to engage in a public mudslinging contest, simply telling callers, "There's more to the situation than you know, but I'm not comfortable discussing the details." This dignified response only fueled speculation. Some family members took Dad's side without question. Others, like Aunt Susan, who knew about the false loan pretenses, were more skeptical of his claims. The divided reactions hurt, but I remained focused on securing my position legally and emotionally. Dad returned to the house several times, sometimes to collect belongings, other times clearly just to intimidate me. During one particularly tense encounter, he discovered that he couldn't locate his rare coin collection. The accusation was immediate and vicious. "You stole my coins. After everything else now, you're a thief too." "I haven't touched your coins," I responded calmly. "But it's interesting that you're more concerned about them than the inheritance money that was supposed to be mine." He stormed through the house, yanking open drawers and closets, making a deliberate mess wherever he went. When he eventually found the coins in a filing cabinet drawer where he had apparently hidden them himself, there was no apology, just a grunt of acknowledgement before he stuffed them into his pockets. As the 30-day notice period progressed, I took practical steps to protect myself. I changed the locks after consulting with my attorney to ensure it was legal given the circumstances. I installed simple security cameras at the front and back doors. I redirected all household bills into my name and opened a new bank account at a different institution than the one Dad and I had both used. The most challenging part was sorting through the financial mess Dad had created. I discovered multiple maxed-out credit cards, a second mortgage I hadn't known about, and gambling debts that explained his increasingly desperate attempts to extract money from family members. The house I now half-owned was underwater, financially worth less than was owed on it due to Dad's financial mismanagement. Working with the attorney, I began the process of formally documenting and addressing the misappropriation of my inheritance. The initial accounting suggested Dad had spent over $100,000 that should have been preserved for my education and future. The money was likely gone for good, but establishing the misappropriation strengthened my legal position regarding the house. During this difficult period, an unexpected source of support emerged. Mom's brother, Uncle James, who had moved across the country years ago and had minimal contact with Dad, reached out after hearing rumors about the situation. Unlike the other relatives who jumped to conclusions, he asked thoughtful questions and really listened to my explanations. "Your mom always worried about how Frank would manage money without her," Uncle James confided during a long phone call. "She was the financially responsible one in their relationship. That's why she was so careful with her will and setting up those trusts for you. She wanted to make sure you were protected no matter what happened." These insights into my parents' relationship were both comforting and painful. Mom had tried to protect me financially, anticipating problems that might arise after her death. Dad had systematically undermined those protections, violating not just legal documents, but the trust my mother had placed in him to honor her wishes. Uncle James shared stories about my parents' early relationship that gave me new perspective. Dad had always had impulsive tendencies with money, it seemed. Mom had been the stabilizing force, the one who ensured bills were paid on time and savings were maintained. Without her influence, Dad had apparently reverted to his natural financial recklessness, but now with access to insurance money and other assets that had amplified the damage he could do. "None of this excuses his behavior," Uncle James assured me. "Using you as an excuse to borrow money, hiding the will, spending your inheritance, those are choices he made and they were wrong. But understanding the pattern might help you make sense of how things got to this point." This context did help me process my feelings, allowing me to see Dad's behavior as part of a longer pattern rather than a sudden betrayal. It didn't lessen my determination to stand my ground, but it did help me approach the situation with slightly more compassion amid the necessary boundary setting. As the 30-day notice period neared its end, Dad made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He showed up with Uncle Robert, his older brother, who had always been something of a bully himself, presumably for moral support and intimidation. They arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, Dad using his old key to attempt entry, only to find the locks changed. The pounding on the door was so aggressive that my neighbor across the street texted to ask if I was okay or needed police assistance. I opened the door, but blocked the entrance security chain in place. "You changed the locks on my house," Dad bellowed, his face contorted with rage. "On our house," I corrected calmly. And yes, for my safety, after your last visit when you ransacked the place looking for your coins. Uncle Robert stepped forward using his imposing physical presence in an attempt to intimidate me. Listen here, young lady. This has gone far enough. Your father has been nothing but generous with you your entire life. This house is his home. You need to stop this vindictive campaign and remember who put a roof over your head all these years. I met his gaze steadily. Uncle Robert, I understand you care about Dad and you're trying to help, but you don't have all the facts. This isn't just about the house. There's much more to this situation that Dad probably hasn't told you. Like what? He challenged. Like the fact that he's been gambling online and hiding overdue bills while telling me he can't afford to feed me, I replied. Or the fact that he misappropriated my inheritance from Mom. Or that he's been borrowing money from relatives under false pretenses, claiming it was to support me when I never saw a penny of it. Uncle Robert's certainty faltered slightly. He turned to Dad. Frank, what is she talking about? Dad's response was telling. He avoided the specific accusations and went straight to emotional manipulation. Are you going to believe her over your own brother? After everything we've been through? She's just a girl who doesn't understand how the real world works. The dismissive "just a girl" comment seemed to land poorly with Uncle Robert, whose own daughter was about my age. His expression shifted subtly. Frank, let's step back and talk about this rationally. He suggested, moving Dad away from the door slightly. If Caroline has legal ownership rights to the house, as she claims, fighting this head-on might not be the best approach. Their hushed conversation continued on the porch while I maintained my position at the door. Eventually, Uncle Robert turned back to me. Caroline, would you consider a compromise? Perhaps your father could rent a room from you until he gets back on his feet financially. You could establish clear rules about bill payments and financial responsibilities. The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but I knew better than to allow Dad back into the house. He would resume the emotional manipulation, potentially escalate to more aggressive tactics, and certainly never acknowledge or address the underlying issues. I appreciate the suggestion, Uncle Robert, but that won't work, I replied firmly. Dad has demonstrated repeatedly that he doesn't respect boundaries, financial or otherwise. The attorney has advised me that a clean break is the healthiest approach for both of us. Dad made a last desperate appeal, his tone suddenly shifting to pitiful. Caroline, please. I'm your father. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? For a moment, I almost wavered. Despite everything, this was the man who had once pushed me on swings, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had been my hero before Mom's death, changed him. But then I remembered the cold look in his eyes when he said he couldn't afford to feed me the years of emotional neglect, the inheritance he had squandered while I worked multiple jobs to get through college. You have options, Dad, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Uncle Robert has offered his spare room. You have your retirement account, which I've never touched, despite having access to our joint accounts. You have your coin collection, which the appraiser valued at nearly $20,000. You're not destitute, you're just facing consequences. The visit ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point. Uncle Robert, seeing Dad's evasiveness about the specific accusations, began to question the narrative he had been fed. Over the following weeks, he became an unlikely ally, helping Dad move into his spare room, but also encouraging him to take responsibility for his actions and seek help for his gambling problem. As the official move-out date arrived, I stood at the window watching Dad load the last of his personal belongings into his car, assisted by Uncle Robert. There was no tearful goodbye, no moment of reconciliation. Just the quiet closing of a chapter that had been filled with deception and disappointment. When the car pulled away, I felt a complex wave of emotions, relief, sadness, guilt, and beneath it all, a fragile sense of hope. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not just physically silent, but free from the constant tension that had permeated every interaction with Dad. I walked slowly through each room, seeing the spaces with new eyes. This wasn't just a house I had legal claim to. It was the container for both happy childhood memories and painful recent ones. It was both a burden and an opportunity. As I traced my fingers along the kitchen counter, where Mom had taught me to bake cookies, I made a decision I would reclaim this space, healing both it and myself in the process. That evening, I sat on the porch swing that had been Mom's favorite spot, watching the sunset with a cup of tea. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe fully. The path ahead would be challenging legally, financially, and emotionally. But for now, in this moment, I had established the most important boundary of all. I would no longer allow anyone, not even my father, to make me feel unworthy of taking up space in this world, or in the home that was now truly mine. In the 6 months that followed Dad's departure, I threw myself into creating a new life and identity independent from the dysfunction that had defined our relationship for so long. The house that had felt like a battleground slowly transformed into a peaceful sanctuary that reflected my personality rather than the frozen museum to the past. It had been under Dad's stewardship. I painted walls that hadn't seen fresh color since Mom was alive, choosing warm, serene tones that made the spaces feel both cozy and contemporary. I rearranged furniture, donated items that carried painful memories, and slowly replaced them with pieces that brought me joy. Each change to the physical space paralleled an internal shift as I reclaimed my confidence and sense of self-worth. Professionally, my dedication during the difficult months of conflict with Dad had not gone unnoticed. My boss called me into her office 3 months after Dad moved out and offered me a promotion to junior account manager with a substantial raise. The financial breathing room this provided was life-changing, allowing me to address the mountain of issues Dad had left behind more effectively. Working with the attorney, I had established clear legal ownership of the house and begun the process of refinancing to address the second mortgage Dad had taken out without my knowledge. The process was complicated and sometimes overwhelming, but each step forward reinforced my growing sense of competence and autonomy. Contact with Dad was limited and carefully boundaried. He had initially continued his campaign of guilt and manipulation through text messages and occasional drop-by attempts, but my consistent enforcement of boundaries eventually led to a reluctant acceptance of the new reality. Uncle Robert's influence had been significant. After the initial confrontation at my door, he had taken time to investigate my claims and discovered I was telling the truth about Dad's gambling and financial deceptions. "He needs help, not enabling," Uncle Robert had said during a rare phone call to check on me. "Living with me means following rules, financial transparency, Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice weekly, and no harassment of you. So far he's complying, though not always gracefully." This arrangement gave me the space to focus on my own healing without constantly managing Dad's crises. I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and codependency, using some of my new income to invest in weekly sessions that helped me process the complex grief of losing the father I thought I had known while setting healthy boundaries with the man he actually was. Through therapy, I began reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during college and the tumultuous months after graduation. Many had no idea what I'd been going through, as I'd become adept at hiding family dysfunction behind a mask of achievement and positivity. Opening up about my experiences was terrifying at first, but ultimately liberating, allowing authentic connections to form. My closest new friend, Jasmine, had experienced similar family financial manipulation and immediately understood aspects of my story that others found hard to comprehend. Our shared experiences created a shorthand understanding that was deeply comforting. With Jasmine and a small circle of other supportive friends, I began building what my therapist called a chosen family, people who genuinely cared for my well-being and respected my boundaries. The first holiday season alone was both challenging and surprisingly freeing. Thanksgiving had always been Mom's favorite holiday, and the first one after her death had been so bleak that the subsequent years had followed the same pattern: Dad working late, a store-bought pie eaten in silence, both of us pretending the emptiness at the table wasn't crushing our spirits. This Thanksgiving, I decided to reclaim the holiday. I invited Jasmine, her partner, and 2 other friends who didn't have local family. Together, we cooked a feast that honored Mom's traditional recipes while adding new dishes that represented our diverse backgrounds and tastes. We laughed, shared stories, and created new memories in the dining room that had seen so many tense, silent meals in recent years. As Christmas approached, I received an unexpected call from Aunt Susan. "I'm hosting Christmas dinner this year," she announced. "Your cousins will all be there, and we'd love to have you join us. No pressure if it's too much, but the invitation is open." The implied absence in her invitation was clear. Dad wasn't included. This created a complex emotional dilemma. Part of me felt guilty at the thought of celebrating with Mom's family while Dad spent the holiday alone, or with Uncle Robert's family, where he might feel like an obligation rather than a welcomed guest. Another part recognized this as an opportunity to reconnect with maternal relatives I had missed deeply. "Will Dad be upset if I come?" I asked hesitantly. Aunt Susan's response was gentle but firm. "Caroline, honey, your father's feelings about who I invite to my home are not your responsibility. You're my niece, my sister's daughter, and I want you at my table. Whatever is happening between you and Frank doesn't change that." This simple statement was revolutionary for me. For years, I had unconsciously accepted responsibility for Dad's emotional state, tiptoeing around his moods and managing his reactions. The idea that I could make choices without weighing their impact on him first was both terrifying and exhilarating. I accepted the invitation. Christmas with Mom's family was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Cousins I had barely seen since the funeral welcomed me warmly. Uncles and aunts shared stories about Mom that I had never heard, painting a fuller picture of her as a mischievous teenager, a determined young professional, and a beloved sister. Dimensions I had missed knowing her only as Mom. During this period, an unexpected development added another layer to my evolving life. A new colleague at work, Thomas, asked me to coffee after we successfully collaborated on a challenging project. The casual work meeting gradually evolved into something more personal as we discovered shared interests in hiking, classic films, and volunteer work. I was hesitant to pursue any romantic connection given the emotional work I was still doing, but Thomas's patient, respectful approach slowly earned my trust. Unlike previous relationship attempts, where I had fallen into caretaking roles that mimicked my dynamic with Dad, this connection felt balanced and healthy. Thomas respected my boundaries, listened attentively to my experiences without trying to fix them, and demonstrated consistent reliability in both small and significant ways. By spring, I had established a life that felt genuinely mine, a career with growth potential, a home that reflected my tastes and values, friendships that nourished rather than drained me, a cautious but promising new relationship, and a much deeper understanding of myself and the family patterns that had shaped me. Dad and I had reached an uneasy détente. Our interactions were infrequent and primarily focused on practical matters related to the house and the ongoing legal proceedings regarding my inheritance. He still occasionally attempted manipulation tactics, but they had lost their power over me. I could now recognize them for what they were and respond with calm detachment rather than emotional reactivity. When I reflected on the dramatic confrontation that had led to this new chapter, the dinner when Dad had coldly stated he couldn't afford to feed me anymore, I felt a complex mixture of sadness for what our relationship could have been and profound gratitude that his cruel words had finally pushed me to break free from the dysfunctional dynamic we had maintained for so long. The journey was far from complete. There were still difficult emotions to process, financial complications to resolve, and new skills to develop as I continued building a life based on authenticity rather than accommodation of unhealthy behaviors. But for the first time since Mom's death, I was moving forward rather than simply surviving. I was becoming someone I believed she would be proud of, strong, compassionate, without being a doormat, and determined to create the life I deserved. 1 year after that fateful dinner confrontation, the transformation in my life was profound. The house had become truly mine in every sense. The legal processes had concluded, establishing my full ownership after Dad agreed to a settlement that addressed the misappropriated inheritance in exchange for me taking full responsibility for the remaining mortgage. With my promotion and careful budgeting, I had begun making double payments to rebuild equity in the property. The physical space reflected the inner changes I had undergone. Every room had been repainted, most furniture replaced or reupholstered. Mom's garden, which had fallen into neglect after her death, was flourishing again with perennials she had planted, supplemented by new varieties I had chosen. The kitchen, where Dad had delivered his cruel ultimatum, had been completely renovated, removing the painful associations and creating a bright, welcoming space where I now enjoyed cooking for friends and hosting small gatherings. Professionally, I had continued to thrive, earning a second promotion to full account manager with responsibility for several key client relationships. My boss had become something of a mentor, recognizing not just my technical skills, but the emotional intelligence and resilience I had developed through my personal challenges. "You have a unique ability to remain calm and solution-focused during client crises," she commented during my annual review. "And your attention to detail with financial matters is exceptional." I had smiled at the irony. My hypervigilance about financial details had developed directly from dealing with Dad's mismanagement and deception. Sometimes our greatest strengths do emerge from our deepest wounds. Contact with Dad remained limited, but had evolved in unexpected ways. After months of minimal, strictly practical communication, he had reached out with what appeared to be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. The letter, an actual handwritten letter rather than a text or email, arrived on what would have been Mom's birthday. "I've been attending therapy through the VA," he wrote, surprising me with this revelation that he was seeking help beyond the Gamblers Anonymous meetings Uncle Robert had required. "My counselor has helped me recognize patterns of behavior that began after your mother died, probably before, if I'm honest." I turned to gambling and collecting to fill the void her absence left. And when those coping mechanisms created financial problems, I blamed others instead of taking responsibility. The letter continued with an acknowledgement of specific harms, hiding the will, spending my inheritance, lying to family members about loans, and attempting to make me feel like a burden when I moved home after college. There was no request for forgiveness, no plea to resume our former relationship. Just a simple statement of accountability followed by, "You deserved better from your father. I am working to become someone worthy of that title again, though I understand that process may take years and may never fully repair the damage I've caused." The letter had left me with complicated feelings. Part of me was skeptical, seeing it potentially as a more sophisticated manipulation attempt. Another part desperately wanted to believe my father was capable of genuine growth and insight. I shared the letter with my therapist, who cautioned against either immediate trust or outright dismissal. "People can change," she observed, "but change is demonstrated through consistent behavior over time, not promises or single gestures. You can acknowledge his efforts without dropping your boundaries." Following this advice, I had responded with a brief note thanking him for his reflections and expressing support for his therapy journey while maintaining my distance. Over the subsequent months, there had been additional signs of change. He had begun repaying Aunt Susan and other family members he had borrowed from. He had maintained sobriety from gambling, according to Uncle Robert, and his communications with me remained respectful of my boundaries without expectation of immediate reconciliation. These developments allowed me to hold a more nuanced view of Dad than the binary loving father of my childhood versus manipulative destroyer of my inheritance. I began to see him as a deeply flawed person who had responded to grief by escaping into addiction, who had made terrible choices that hurt those around him, but who might also be capable of genuine remorse and change. This perspective helped me release some of the anger that had been weighing on me. I wasn't ready to resume regular contact or trust him with any significant role in my life, but I could wish for his healing journey to continue without feeling responsible for facilitating it. My own healing journey had progressed significantly. Through therapy, supportive relationships, and deliberate self-reflection, I had developed a clearer understanding of the patterns that had shaped my relationship with Dad and how they had influenced other areas of my life. I recognized my tendency to take responsibility for others' emotions while neglecting my own needs, a pattern that had begun with trying to manage Dad's moods after Mom died. I saw how I had chosen romantic partners who needed caretaking friendships where I gave far more than I received, and work situations where I overperformed without appropriate recognition or compensation. With this awareness came the power to make different choices. My relationship with Thomas had deepened precisely because it broke these patterns. He was emotionally self-sufficient while being genuinely supportive of my goals and needs. We had recently begun discussing the possibility of him moving in, though I was proceeding cautiously, treasuring my hard-won independence and ensuring any cohabitation would be a partnership of equals rather than a return to caretaking dynamics. My circle of friends had evolved to include people who gave as much as they received, who respected boundaries, and who valued authentic connection over performance or people-pleasing. Weekly dinners with this chosen family had become a highlight, filling the house with laughter and creating new positive memories in spaces once dominated by tension and silence. The financial lessons learned through Dad's deception had paradoxically set me on a path to greater security than many of my peers. I had become meticulous about budgeting, saving, and investing, turning the hypervigilance born of trauma into a practical skill set. By my 25th birthday, I had established an emergency fund, begun retirement savings, and created a plan for eventually paying off the house entirely. Perhaps most importantly, I had developed a relationship with myself based on self-compassion rather than the harsh inner critic that had developed during years of trying to earn Dad's approval and attention. I could now recognize my inherent worth separate from achievement or productivity, understanding that I deserved care and respect simply for being human, not because I had earned it through perfection or performance. This journey from emotional dependence to self-reliance hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks, days of crushing doubt, moments when the easier path of returning to old patterns seemed tempting. The work of healing would likely continue throughout my life. But looking back on the person I had been a year ago, afraid to stand up to Dad, confused about my rights, uncertain of my worth, I barely recognized her. The cruel words that had sparked this transformation, "I can't afford to feed you anymore," now seemed almost like a gift, the breaking point that had forced me to advocate for myself when nothing else had prompted that necessary change. Sometimes, the most painful moments truly do become doorways to freedom, if we have the courage to walk through them. As I sat on the porch swing one evening, watching the sunset in the garden Mom had loved, I felt her presence more strongly than I had in years. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the recognition that her strength and wisdom had flowed into me, helping me find my voice when it mattered most. I had honored her memory not by accepting mistreatment in silence, but by standing firmly for the security she had tried to provide for me and the values she had lived by. "I think you'd be proud, Mom," I whispered to the twilight air. "I'm building a life with both roots and wings, just like you always wanted for me." The journey ahead would hold challenges and joys I couldn't yet imagine. There would be further decisions about my relationship with Dad, career paths to navigate, and perhaps someday a family of my own to raise with the wisdom gained from both my parents' successes and failures. But whatever came next, I would face it as a woman who knew her worth, owned her power, and understood that sometimes the greatest act of love for others and for yourself is setting clear, firm boundaries and having the courage to enforce them. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's sometimes the most important act of self-preservation. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that you deserve to take up space in this world, no matter what anyone else might say.